their condition. Now they're mailing themselves to the CEO suite.
Rick, we're lucky to have you at the IMC.
It's a pleasure to be here again.
It is the occasion of the 20th anniversary,
That's extraordinary.
and I think you have a history with the IMC. So let's hear a little bit about that.
Well, I think, I grew up in Urbana. I spent a lot of time as a teenager and a young 20s working on various political activities, especially anti-war activities around the Peace Resource Center. And the Peace Resource Center at the Illinois Disciples Foundation was a kind of a proto-IMC. It was literally a place where a lot of media, magazines and alternative publications and things like that were available. I believe that some of the folks instrumental in keeping that place open then transferred some of their efforts into the creation of the IMC. But independent media centers at that time, the year 2000, were sprouting up all over the country. And at that time, I wasn't living in Urbana anymore. I was living in San Diego, but I was part of a touring outfit known as the Prince Mishkins, folk duo or acoustic duo. Folk is debatable. Who performed in all sorts of activist-related events and causes. And so we were very excited by the IMC movement. We just thought it was fantastic that people were coming up with alternatives to the mainstream media. And at that time, a thing that we all talked about a lot was the fact that primarily people were interested in forming an alternative to the news media. And I wanted to also bring in, well, what about an alternative to the entertainment media? Really, a lot of United States citizens get as much information in terms of like picture of what they think the world is like from entertainment as they get from news, if not more. So it's an interesting thought, like what's the alternative entertainment media? And it's a little bit awkward to talk about because we don't like to think of what we do as entertainment. It sounds fluffy, but seriously, activists need to do something in their downtime. And if it's just go see a new Spielberg movie, then that's a problem. So the alternative media and expanding what that term meant was kind of the way that I saw myself as connecting to independent media centers around the country. And because I had grown up in Urbana and knew a lot of the people involved with this one here, we did a lot of performances here in that first year of the IMC's existence.
And how about in this building here, which was about 5 years in?
This was 2005, right, that this building showed up? Yeah, at that time, I had moved to Madison, Wisconsin with my fellow Prince Mishkin, Andy Grisovich, and an actor named Ryan Higgins, and we formed a collective called the Nonsense Company that was dedicated to experimental activist theater, which we then sort of appended to our acoustic music touring. So a space like this one was an extraordinary opportunity to see what kinds of use could be made of a space, not just to do something a little bit that people are used to, which is go to hear an evening of songs, but also see maybe a play or something that's a little bit like a play, but is also kind of experimentally historical. So I think just a couple months after this building was first inaugurated, we did a couple of performances down in the basement. One I particularly remember in the Books to Prisoners room, which was a very narrow room with books on all sides, which was great for, theatrically speaking. It looked wonderful. And we did a play about the history, I call it like a theatrical meditation on the history of the education of Simone Bolivar. The kind of thing that you could not do if you just waltzed into town and said, hey, Cranert, we want to do this thing in your main theater. So the IMC was a great experimental location for events like that. And for the next couple of years, as we were touring around the country, but based in Madison, we would always stop here, sometimes to kind of try out the stuff that we were going to do on the road.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the IMC, an experimental workshop for all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And we're still that today.
Fabulous.
And you were talking about the alternative entertainment. I think the IMC YouTube channel is a form of alternative entertainment.
Excellent.
And when people started to take to the streets and have incredible protests, not seen here since maybe the 70s in size. We thought, why let the News Gazette be the ones writing about this? And we decided to go ahead and interview people directly and see who are the people behind this and what do they have to say about it in a little more detail when they're sitting down
Right.
and thinking, and when they're not out on the street. And so we started the CCARC interview series, and now we're bringing you into that series.
Well, all
So
right.
we're right into the alternative entertainment.
That's fantastic. Of course, right now it's a little odd because alternative entertainment is the only entertainment. I said this.
right.
At this point, I now have what you might call a career doing theater based in New York City, but live theater in more or less mid-sized to large institutional settings. And that, of course, can't happen now. And who knows when it's going to be able to happen again. So alternative entertainment is not only really exciting, it's also essential. And I don't know what we would do without it.
Right. Absolutely. Well, it's a pleasure to be here doing this. A couple things came up as you were talking, which I think there's an interesting story, is how is it that we're so lucky to have you here? You talked about the Prince Michigans, you talked about Wisconsin. Can you tell us a little bit about how you ended up in Champaign-Urbana?
You mean this particular moment?
Of the pandemic.
Well, as a matter of fact, the Prince Michigans were about to do a Get Out the Vote tour back in March around the Midwest. Several cities, a lot of places with college students who would have been like registering to vote for the first time and that kind of thing. So I flew from Brooklyn to Madison, Wisconsin, which is where Andy Grisovich, the other Prince Michigan, still lives. And that was March 10th. And then everything shut down on March 12th, or started shutting down. So the tour could not happen at that time. And I made my way here to my ancestral home, which was always part of the plan, that a visit to Urbana would have been part of that tour. Thinking, oh sure, I'll just stay in Urbana for a month or two while all this plays itself out. And now, 6 months later, here we are. But I definitely should, shout out to my parents, Richard and Jane Burkardt, who have been putting me up this whole time in the house that I have lived in for, I guess we moved into it when I was 14. So for a couple of years then, and now it's been 6 more months. History can change.
That's right. Well, at least as things unfolded, we found you here in our community.
Well, it's been fun for me too. This is an extraordinary town.
Mm-hmm.
And beautiful. You know what you have in this town that no one else has? Those white globe-like streetlights. Those are amazing. I just thought those were normal when I was growing up here as a kid. And I remember moving to San Diego and thinking, they don't have streetlights here. And I thought it was because they were like Republicans and didn't want to pay for civic stuff, which is true. But what I didn't realize is that it's actually pretty uncommon to not only have like streetlights all over, but just to have them be absolutely stunningly gorgeous. So take pride in that, Urbana.
All right.
Don't say I never complimented you.
Yeah, it is a beautiful place.
It is.
So what do you think is coming next for you?
Well, I'm planning to head back to Brooklyn. In fact, I was planning to do that in just a couple of weeks. However, as of just about a week ago, New York put Illinois on the quarantine list, meaning that when I go back to New York, I'm going to have to quarantine in my apartment for 14 days, which is not impossible. I can do that. But I was kind of planning to spend October trying to do more Get Out the Vote stuff, so being stuck in my apartment may not be the best way to do that, or there may be a way, who knows. So I'm just, what looked like a pretty definite plan has now turned into a plan with multiple variables. So I'm not sure exactly what happens to me next logistically speaking, but I know that October is Get Out the Vote month.
Mm-hmm. And what's going on in the world of composition for instrumentalists?
Quite a lot. So Keith and I were both students at the University of Illinois Music School in the 90s, and we both studied experimental sort of chamber music composition, and I still do that quite a bit, so do you. Of course, like everything else, live performances have been shut down for the last 6 months, and we're not sure exactly when they start up again in a full-fledged way. I know that some people in New York have been doing some outdoor performance experiments and things like that. My music is pretty quiet and isn't going to work in most outdoor spaces, I think. But maybe like a cool parking garage or something with a lot of echo. I don't know. There's a couple of ensembles that I'm working with. International Contemporary Ensemble that used to be based in Chicago is now based in New York. I'm working on a piece for them. I'm trying to think if there's any more Urbana connections. There used to be a whole Urbana expatriate community in the music ecosystem of New York City. Not quite so much anymore. But anyway, I have commissions that I'm working on, but not at the moment any clear deadlines.
Right.
Because performance will start up again eventually, but we don't know exactly how and when.
Mm-hmm. And looking back to some historical things, maybe you could tell me when and how did you join the Performers Workshop Ensemble?
Oh, well, that's a very interesting story. I was a high school student at University High School, and I did drama there. There wasn't exactly a drama program there in the 1980s, but there was a really great English teacher named Audrey Wells who would direct a couple of plays a year, basically, for most of the time that I was there. When I became a senior, which would have been 1986, she declared she did not want to have this job anymore. So they decided to hire an outside agitator, and that was Jeff Glassman, a fellow who's still local here in Urbana, a great artist who works in like mime movement theater. It's hard to describe exactly what he does with a genre, but it's fascinating, beautiful stuff. And he came, showed up sort of, as I remember, like first week of school and said, well, you all are writing the fall play. And uni high students believe they can do anything, so we did. We wrote the fall play. It was 3 hours long, totally baffling, I'm sure. Had the time of our lives. It was absolutely a blast. And during that time, Jeff Glassman invited a bunch of us to come and see some of the work that his friends did. And that was a group called the Performers Workshop Ensemble, which at the time was doing house theaters on Oregon Street in Urbana. They would do these sort of evening-length cabarets with all kinds of different things. The first one that I saw had theater. It had extremely beautiful atonal contemporary music. It also had some electronic experimental kind of dance music and some Greek rebettica music. Did I pronounce that right at all?
Mm-hmm.
That was okay? All right, good.
Yeah.
And I was just enthralled. It was my first time ever hearing atonal music, and it was just, lights gleaming and angels blowing trumpets in a very unusual way. And so I just continued to try to stay in Jeff Glassman's orbit. And what ended up happening was that group of people, the Performers Workshop Ensemble, who created those house theaters, came to see the performance that we, the students, did at Uni High School, invited us to make a house theater out of that performance, which we did. And at that point, I was basically hooked. So that would make me sort of a 17-year-old. I met Herbert Brun, who was a professor at the university then, and started to listen to his music and listen to some of the music that he was interested in. And slowly over time, I continued to do performances at this house, and then the group began touring more. I started going on the tours with them. It was a little bit of a porous group in terms of how you actually entered, as I remember. Like there was no moment when they said, okay, you're now officially a member of the group. It was just the time when you noticed that you were being invited on most of the tours that you realized that was who you were now. So that's the way I remember it. They might remember it entirely differently. And then I became a student at the University of Illinois and joined that side of the group's activity as well.
Theaters were an amazing thing, and I think also at the end of my high school years, I went to the first house theater, and it definitely changed my idea about what performing of music could be and what could be happening in the context of performing music, what else could be happening in the context. And I think that set me up on a career path that had always parallels in curating events and creating festivals and doing things in strange places and strange
Absolutely.
collaborations.
Yeah.
But I think the really burning question that our audience wants to know is, what's the history of 20 consonant poetry?
20 consonant poetry. Well, okay, so 12-tone music is a form of arranging notes and harmonies in music that was first formalized by a composer named Arnold Schoenberg near the beginning of the 20th century. And it's a little hard to explain, but fundamentally the simplest way of describing the idea is there are 12 notes in a scale, and according to this principle that Schoenberg proposed, we're going to make a row using each of those notes once, and you're going to only be able to repeat a note after you've played all the other notes at least once. Forgive me if you know that I didn't quite exactly describe that right, but that's just one way of telling, that's what a 12-tone composer is dealing with. So at some point, a friend of mine, and I believe it was Joe Futrell, I could be wrong, made a joke, which was, what if we did the same thing with 26-letter poetry? What if we tried to write poetry where you could only use a letter again once you had used all of the other 25 letters? We all laughed because naturally that would be impossible, although there is a 26-letter poem, which is Mr. Jock, TV Quiz, PhD, bags few links. But none of us wrote that. I don't know where that came from. William Gillespie, a writer who lives in Urbana, was at some point around that time tasked with coming up with like a series of interesting experimental poetry assignments to give to high school students. And he came to the conclusion that while 26-letter poetry might just be too difficult and unsatisfying, what about 20 consonant poetry? What if you say that all the vowels are free, you can use as many vowels as you want, but you have to use all of the consonants in a kind of a row before you can repeat any consonant. And he proposed that idea, and again, we all sort of laughed at it, and we looked, his list of assignments had a lot of assignments that were easier than that one. But one night I got really, I don't know, something just stirred in my soul, and I went to my IBM PC computer with a dot matrix printer, and I wrote and printed out what I'm going to call the first 20 consonant poem, certainly the first long form poem, and it was, by long form, it was probably like 10 or 12 lines long, which was called The Heckler. And it started with the line, tuxedo glaze, quasi-joke and vibe, you chomp a waver and raise you half-crazy voice, quiet, a pox on my wage job. I think that was, I may have misquoted it slightly. But you can hear in that like, as a nascent poetic form, it already sounds like it has a kind of a vernacular to it, because certain of the consonants like Q and Z, you got to sort of plan around them. And words like quiet or quaffed become incredibly useful. Max inquired about the fizzle. Jake, go sweep a cave, a bizarre task. Max quaffed a huge VW jalopy. I may be missing a line, but can people live big? Jake quipped, dizzy as the queer moon broke amid ozone holes. So you'll notice, because I'm sure that you're following along at home, that by the time that poem, Max and Jake, was written, a rule had been instituted, and we called it Rick's Rule because I proposed it, but several of us had our own rules named after ourselves at that point. And mine was that you can use a double consonant if it's like, quipped. There's two P's in that word, but we only have one P sound. So that was the initial understanding of Rick's Rule. Later understandings of Rick's Rule were that you can use actually a consonant over and over again as long as no other consonant intervenes. So you can get lines like, Yo mama made mop a joke, a kid did a baby baroque, oh heavy was a six of a fuzz, a gig got a toot to tone loke. So that was an attempt, obviously, to write a 20-consonant limerick. I'm not sure if it fully succeeded, but got a toot to tone loke definitely makes use of the extended understanding of Rick's rule, where T can be repeated over and over again as long as no other consonant comes in between all those T's.
Consistent with the composition of 12-note music.
Absolutely. No, I mean, we definitely did a lot of historical research to make sure that we weren't doing something that would have been just scandalous to a bunch of Austrians in the 1920s. And this genre really got a lot of purchase. A bunch of people were composing 20-consonant poems for many, many years in the mid-90s, including my father, who was a historian of biology, who wrote one of my very favorite 20-consonant poems, which is Exit the Quagga. And if you're not familiar with the quagga is a now extinct form of zebra-donkey hybrid that lived at least until the 19th century. I've in fact seen the taxidermied quagga that's now in the Jardin des Plantes in Paris. But yeah, my dad's poem, Exit the Quagga, was all about extinct animals and the tragedies that have befallen them. And I just remember that it ended with a line something like, the sad gaze of an unhappy gazelle lost to taxidermy, which is a marvelous use of double T's followed by an X, which is the kind of thing that you get excited about when you're a 20-consonant poet enthusiast.
And 20-consonant poetry set to music or placed inside a music composition?
There have been several examples. I think the most extensive is Mark Enslin's piano piece Unentitled, which is a substantial piano piece that I in fact commissioned him to write in the early 90s, but he didn't finish it until 10 years later, and by that time I didn't have a piano anymore, so I have not learned to perform the piece, I am ashamed to say. However, Susan Parenti does a spectacular performance of Mark Enslin's Unentitled, which has long stretches of 20-consonant text recited by the pianist as she's performing. And there have been some others, but that one I think is kind of the grandest example.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been some 20-consonant folk songs as well.
Right. And that 20-consonant limerick, could you recite it again? I think there was some noise going on in the mail.
Yo mama may mop up a joke. A kid did a baby baroque. Oh, heavy we was, a six of a fuzz, a gig got a toot to tone loke.
All right. Excellent. Well, thanks for sitting down with us and having a chat.
It's been a real pleasure.
All right.
Beyond what I ever imagined it could be, in fact.
Absolutely.
What a memory lane stroll that was.
All right. Well, everybody, we're happy to be bringing this to a theater near
Have
you.
impeccable standards. Hollyhocks in the box, squirting secret secrete.